This paranormal novel is narrated by two voices.
each offering a different perspective.
Chapter 1.
The rope cut deeper every time I dragged air into my lungs. Splinters from the execution post scored my back through my dress, hot pitch dripped from the stacked wood at my feet, and the whole city square smelled of rain, smoke, and eager fear. On the black stone dais above me, Leontes Dacien broke the royal seal on my death order with the same hand that had cradled my jaw the night before. I could still feel the imprint of his thumb beneath my mouth, could still hear the rough astonishment in his voice when our scents had collided in the moonlit archive and the world had gone white around us. It had not been a question. It had been a strike of lightning through bone, the sacred shock every child was taught happened only once in 1,000 lifetimes, the instant knowing of a true pair. He had breathed my name like a prayer then. He had said, so low I felt it more than heard it, "I found you." Now he looked over the crowd as if I were ash already. "By order of the crown and in witness of the assembled packs," he said, his voice carrying clean and cold over the square. "Apolline Verenne stands accused of blasphemy, illicit mooncraft, and bearing the mark of the hollow god." A murmur shivered through the crowd, then rose into a snarling wave. Someone threw rotten fruit, and it burst wetly against the wood near my ankle. I twisted against the ropes until my wrists burned raw. Leontes. His name tore out of me before pride could stop it. "Look at me." For one brutal heartbeat, he did. His eyes were silver gray in the morning light, hard as drawn steel, but underneath the hardness I saw something worse than hatred. I saw pain so deep it almost looked like guilt, and then it vanished behind the face of an alpha prince. "The mark manifested at dawn," he said to the crowd. "Not to me. You all know the law. Anything claimed by the dead moon belongs to ruin." He lifted his hand, and the black signet on his finger flashed. "Burn her." The square erupted. Alphas shouted for fire. Betas spat curses. A woman in the front clutched her child and covered the child's nose as if my scent itself were poison. I tried to speak again, but memory hit me so hard my knees nearly gave. Last night, I had been shelving forbidden star ledgers in the lower archive, alone except for dust and candle smoke, when the door had slammed open and he had come in like a storm in black uniform and wet leather. He was not supposed to walk those corridors without guard or herald. I was not supposed to be close enough to smell the first sharp note of cedar and winter on his skin. We had both frozen. The candle flame had snapped sideways. Then the world had changed. My pulse had gone wild first, then steady, as if some older rhythm had laid itself over mine. A sweetness like split pears and frost had flooded the room, my scent answering his without permission, and he had crossed the space between us with a look on his face that no crown could have taught him. It was awe. It was hunger, it was home. He had touched the center of my chest with two shaking fingers, as though proving I was solid. "Apolline," he had said, after only one breath near me, after no introduction at all. "You're mine." Then, just as fiercely, "No, I'm yours." I had laughed once from pure disbelief, and he had laughed too, helpless and stunned, the sound almost boyish on a man built for war. We had stood there trembling in the candlelight, forehead to forehead, while that impossible recognition roared through us. It had felt holy. At dawn, I woke in my narrow chamber with silver pain blazing under my left ribs. I tore my chemise aside and saw a crescent there, not bright and living like the moon's blessed sign, but fractured, as though something dead beneath my skin had cracked itself awake. Before I could even cover it, soldiers kicked in my door. A torch dropped into the kindling at my feet. Heat licked upward at once, greedy and orange, and the first breath of smoke clawed into my throat. I coughed hard enough to taste blood and stared at Leontes through the moving shimmer. If this was a mask, it was too cruel. If it was truth, then last night had been the lie. "You called me your fate," I shouted, because dying silent would have been worse. The square hushed just enough for my words to carry. "Was that before or after you decided to murder me?" His jaw flexed. The knuckles around the decree tightened. For a second, I thought he might step down, cut me loose, tell them all they could choke on their laws. Instead, he said, "Fate is not always mercy." Then he turned his face away. The flames climbed higher. Resin popped. My skirt smoked at the hem. Panic tore through me so violently I nearly blacked out, and then the crowd at the square's eastern edge began to scream for a different reason. A line of figures in ash-gray veils burst through the market stalls like ghosts. They moved fast and low, blades flashing only when they had to, and they did not run like soldiers. They ran like people who had spent their whole lives escaping. One of them hurled a clay globe into the pyre. It burst with a hiss, vomiting silver powder that killed flame on contact and sent up a choking cloud. Another climbed the scaffold itself, small and wiry, face hidden, pupils milk-white behind the slit of the veil. Blind. I thought in a flash of terror and wonder, blind and moving better than anyone with sight. The knife at my wrists was cold and precise. "Do not fight us," a woman's voice said near my ear. "If he truly wants you dead, the square will finish what he started. If he does not, let him prove it by failing to stop us." The ropes fell. My legs nearly folded under me, but 2 sets of hands caught me before I hit the embers. Arrows began to rain. The crowd surged. Somewhere above the smoke, somebody was shouting Leontes' name. I looked back once as they dragged me into the choking white cloud. He stood on the dais with his hand half raised, every soldier in the square waiting on his command. His eyes locked on mine through the haze. He did not order them to fire.
Chapter 2. The worst part was not hearing her call me a liar. The worst part was wanting to answer. I kept my spine straight on the dais while the smoke swallowed her, while my soldiers glanced up for the command that would have turned the square into a slaughter pit, and I bit down so hard the inside of my mouth filled with blood. If I chased her, the thing hunting her would have my trail. If I claimed her, it would have our bond. If I broke character for even a second, the priests of the crown would see it and finish what my father began. Captain Morcant shoved through the guards to my side with his sword half drawn. "Your Highness, give the order." He was panting, eyes bright with the thrill of sanctioned violence. "We can still catch them." I watched the ash-veiled sect vanish into the lower alleys with Apolline between them. A sliver of relief hit so hard it was almost dizzying. Then I made my face colder than winter. "No." Morcant stared around us. The crowd was turning ugly with confusion, muttering that a witch had slipped royal justice, that a prince had gone soft, that the old omens were waking. I let them mutter. Better their contempt than her corpse. "Seal the eastern quarter," I said. "Search the river exits and the tannery tunnels. Arrest anyone carrying moon ash." I made sure to sound furious, made sure the words cracked like a whip. "Bring me the sect leaders alive." My order sent the soldiers running. It also sent them in the wrong direction. The blind zealots never used the river when they took a marked one. They used the old salt vaults beneath the shrine district, because scent drowned there in mineral damp and old bones. Morcant lowered his voice. "You should not have let her speak to you." He glanced at the deadened pyre, then at the broken line of the crowd. People noticed. "Let them notice fear," I said. A prince who executes a witch and loses her to fanatics still looks stronger than a prince who hesitates over a woman. I turned to him slowly. "You are alive because you have served me well. Do not mistake that for license." He bowed at once, but not before I caught the flicker in his expression. Calculation. Men like Morcant always calculated near a crown. They wanted to know how much blood stood between them in favor. When he left, I finally let myself breathe. The thread between me and Apolline had not vanished after my public rejection. It had cinched down to something narrow, painful, and hidden, like a hot wire buried in flesh. Good. The ritual words before witnesses had shuttered the bond from ordinary detection. Badly, imperfectly, and not for long. I could still feel her fear pulsing at the edge of me, ragged and bright, and beneath that fear something older had begun to stir. The mark. I closed my fist over the signet ring until its edges bit skin. At dawn, when the fractured crescent had risen on her ribs, I had felt the answering chill in the bones of the palace. Not power, absence. The kind of holy wrongness priests pretended did not survive the old wars. The hollow god had been killed centuries ago, or so the liturgies claimed, but dead things with enough worship did not always stay dead. Some learned to move through doors other beings made for them. A fresh mating bond was the widest door in the world. That was why I had stood in her chamber with 10 soldiers and a face carved from ice while she stared at me like I had driven a blade through her heart. That was why I had read the law against her with every noble house watching from their balconies. The entity called to the marked through desire, and it traced them through possession. So I had denied her publicly before it could finish finding us. I had made myself the knife instead of the key. It should have been enough to buy a few days. It should not have felt like I had skinned myself alive. I left the square by the western stair and took the covered passage into the palace, shedding the roar of the crowd one stone corridor at a time. Servants flattened themselves against the walls. Courtiers pretended not to stare. The whole place already smelled of rumor. In my private armory, I barred the door and tore open my shirt. Across my own sternum, hidden beneath linen and rank and duty, a faint silver line burned where no mark should have been. Not the broken crescent on her skin. A thread, a wound-shaped answer. False or true, I said into the empty room, because I needed the words to exist somewhere outside my skull. You are still mine to protect. My voice sounded hoarse, almost unrecognizable, and I will burn this kingdom down before I let the crown or the dead take you. A knock struck the door 3 times in the pattern, only one person used. I covered the line on my chest and let the bolts fall. My spy master, old Dame Sorel, slipped inside without waiting for welcome, her cane tapping once on the stone. The sect took her, she said. Not your doing, despite what 3 counselors already suspect. Her blind eye turned milky in the torchlight. Her good eyes stayed razor-sharp. There's more. The coronation has been moved forward. I went still. How far? 3 nights. Her mouth thinned. The crown priests are afraid. They think the mark is an omen. They want you enthroned before anything else can manifest. And once you wear the diadem of concordance, every bond in the realm answers directly to you. To me, they thought, in truth, the diadem answered to the mechanism beneath the throne hall. The hidden lunar engine my father used to counterfeit destinies and leash the pacts with sacred language. If I could reach it during the coronation, I could shatter the system. If I failed, the entire realm would kneel to a machine that could manufacture love like a sentence. Find the sect, I said, quietly, not to seize her, to watch. I met Sorel's gaze and let her see the fury I could show no one else. If the priests touch her before I do, we lose everything. Chapter 3.
They took me below the city through a butcher's cellar, down past hooks and salt vats and a trapdoor hidden under split pig bones. By the time the square noise faded, my wrists were bleeding, my hair smelled of smoke, and my chest hurt in 2 places at once, where the rope had cut and where his betrayal would not stop throbbing. The tunnels were older than the kingdom above them. Water crawled down the walls in silver threads, lamps smoked in iron niches, and all around me the ash-veiled rescuers moved with eerie assurance, tapping stone with short staffs and never once missing a turn. Every second or third face I glimpsed had the same clouded, useless eyes. I had heard stories of the oath-blinded. Every noble child heard them. Omegas who had burned out their own sight with moon ash rather than submit to pact contracts, breeding registries, or scent-binding rites, zealots, criminals, heretics, depending on who was telling the story. None of the stories had mentioned how gently they handled me when my knees buckled. None had mentioned the absolute silence that fell whenever one of them tilted their ruined eyes toward my ribs, as if the mark beneath my dress made even fanatics afraid. They brought me into a vaulted chamber lined with old shrine pillars. A woman sat waiting on a stone seat draped in dark wool, her hair silver and braided with tiny bells, her blind eyes painted over with a line of black lacquer. She looked old enough to have watched kingdoms rise and rot, yet her posture held like a spear. Apolline Verenne, she said, daughter of Nopak, archivist of the lower palace records, newly condemned witch and newly coveted symbol. Her mouth curved without warmth. Welcome. If this is rescue, I said, my voice shredding around the edges, you could begin by cutting the rest of the rope from my skin. I jerked my chin at the burn-smudged cord still hanging from my waist and telling me why blind strangers care whether I live. One of her attendants stepped in at once and freed me the rest of the way. The silver-haired woman listened to the rasp of fiber hitting stone, then folded her hands. I am Mother Nereza. We care because men like your prince build thrones on the myth of fated obedience. She lifted her face toward me. And because the dead moon has touched you, I flinched at the word your before prince. I hated that she had noticed. I hated more that my pulse betrayed me when she said him. He is not my prince, I said. He nearly burned me alive. Yes, she did not sound surprised. That is what it looked like. Rage helped me stay upright. You speak as if there is another version. There is always another version when an alpha wears a public face. Nereza inclined her head. Whether his hidden face is kinder or crueler is a separate question. We will let time answer that. I wanted to reject the opening she gave him. I wanted to hold on to anger because it was cleaner than the alternative, but my body would not forget the previous night, the impossible pull of him, the way the air itself had changed when he came near. He knew me by scent before I said a word, I whispered, hating the tremor that entered my voice. He looked at me like he had been searching his whole life. You do not counterfeit that. A rustle passed through the chamber. Not shock, pity. Nerissa rose and came down from the stone seat without help, her bare feet soundless on the floor. When she stopped in front of me, she did not reach for my face or my hands. She reached for the air between us, where my scent would be strongest, and inhaled carefully through her nose. "You think the sacred moment proves itself?" she said. "Most do." Her ruined eyes remained fixed on nothing. "Sit, child. There are records you were never meant to read." They fed me broth first, thick with herbs that dulled the shaking in my limbs, then dressed the burns on my wrists with bitter salve. Only after the practical mercies were done did they bring the box. It was lacquered black and sealed with wax stolen from the royal archive. My stomach turned before they even opened it. I knew that seal. I had catalogued its pattern in the lower stacks, year after year, never once guessing what documents it protected. Nereza broke the wax and removed a packet of vellum tied with gold thread. Breeding accords, compatibility schedules, scent harmonics, coronation pairing drafts, her fingers brushed each page with memorized precision. The mathematics of destiny written by human hands. I stared at the columns, names, pack lines, estrus cycles, blood classifications, notes on resonance amplification. My scalp prickled. "This is livestock bookkeeping," I said.
Exactly, Nereza's voice sharpened. "Except your nobles call it holy governance. The Crown's lunar engine can induce recognition between selected candidates under the right ritual conditions. Not in all cases, not perfectly,
but often enough to keep the realm obedient to the idea that Alpha Command is sanctified by the heavens." My mouth went dry. I wanted to laugh in her face. I wanted to call her mad. Instead, I kept reading, because the numbers in front of me were real, and the language was official, and somewhere deep in my training I recognized the careful cruelty of state records. "No," I said, but the denial had already weakened. "No, what happened last night was..." I stopped. Sacred, tender, shattering. None of those words would help me if the kingdom had learned how to counterfeit them. Nerissa turned her head toward me. "What happened last night may still have been profound. Human hearts are excellent at becoming real around imposed beginnings." She paused. "That does not make the beginning sacred." I looked down at my own hands because I could not bear the thought of anyone seeing my face. If the bond had been fabricated, then the worst wound was not that Leontes condemned me. It was that the universe had never chosen us at all. But then why had fear cracked his voice for one hidden second on the dais? Why had he failed to stop my rescue? Why did my chest still ache as if a thread stretched through the stone and all the city to wherever he was breathing? "What do you want from me?" I asked quietly. "Besides my usefulness." Nereza did not soften. I respected her more for it. At the coronation, the Alpha heir will take the diadem and renew the lie that fate belongs to the throne. Your mark can interrupt the right. A hush fell around her words. Or destroy it. "You want me to walk into the palace that tried to kill me and stand in a hall full of men who would rather see me flayed?" "Yes," she said. "If you survive long enough to choose it." I laughed then. Once, sharp and ugly. It felt dangerously close to tears. "So I escaped one pyre to become another person's weapon." Nereza's face changed, not into kindness, but into something almost sorrowful. "In this kingdom, child, women like us are always somebody's weapon. The trick is deciding where we point."
Chapter 4. The throne crypt lay 2 levels below the coronation hall, behind a chapel wall that only royal blood could open. I went there at midnight with a lamp in one hand and my father's signet in the other, because if I stayed above ground any longer I was going to start killing counselors in public. The hidden lock drank blood before the stone moved. The corridor beyond exhaled cold air that smelled of iron filings and long-dead incense. I had walked it once as a boy, holding my father's hand, thinking I was being shown a sacred inheritance. Tonight I knew better. Sacred things did not hum like shackled beasts. At the corridor's end lay the lunar engine, a disk of black metal taller than 3 men, sunk into the wall and banded with silver channels that pulsed faintly when I came near. Around it, racks of crystal phials held old scent distillations labeled with family names. Above it, carved into obsidian, were the ancient prayers to harmony and order. Order, another word for managed desire. Sorel waited beside the mechanism with a ledger tucked under one arm. She had already dismissed the priests I bribed to leave us this hour, and the satisfaction in her expression almost made this place tolerable. "You were right," she said. "The engine has been primed for the coronation. More heavily than usual." "For what?" "Not what? Who?" She handed me the ledger. "You?" I opened it, and felt all the heat leave my body. My name stood on the first page in ceremonial script. Leontes Dacien, Crown Heir, Alpha Prime Line. Under it, columns of crossed-out pairings stretched back 6 years, candidate after candidate deemed insufficient, unstable, unresponsive. On the final page, written in fresher ink, was one entry that should not have existed. Subject: Apolline Verenne. Archive cast unaffiliated. No registered pack, no authorized hormonal profile, no approved line compatibility. Under that, a note in a hand I recognized as the High Priest's. Spontaneous resonance outside programmed parameters. Investigate anomaly. Contain immediately. I read it twice, then a third time, because rage can make letters blur into wishes. The entry did not change. She was not selected, I said. No, Sorel's good eye was grim, which means your bond may be the first real one this system failed to control. She tapped the next page with one blunt finger, or the engine is evolving. I wanted certainty, and got none. That had become the pattern since Apolline stepped into my life, every answer splitting into two sharper questions. If our recognition was real, then the Crown had tried to bury it. If it was engineered by some mechanism beyond this ledger, then why call it anomaly? Either way, my feelings had not come out of a machine. I knew the difference between compulsion and awe. The realm might not. There's more, Sorel said. I turned the page. A chart of symbols filled the spread, all lunar phases and sacrificial ciphers, and at the center was the broken crescent mark, now living under Apolline's skin. My heart slammed once, heavy and sick. The priests call it the seal of the hollow vessel, Sorel said quietly. A host mark. When the dead moon god was dismembered in the old rebellion, one fragment escaped binding. The records say it can return only through a living bearer connected to a coronation conduit. She looked at the engine, and through a fully opened mating bond, I shut the ledger so hard the sound cracked through the crypt. Then they know what she is. They suspect. Sorel's voice did not waver. Which is why they accelerated your enthronement. If they can use the diadem to control the manifestation, they gain a divine terror to rule by. If they fail, the host dies and they call it necessary sacrifice. For one hot, blinding second, I imagined dragging every priest in the palace down into this chamber and feeding them to their own machine. The fantasy steadied me more than prayer would have. Can the mark be removed? Not cleanly. She hesitated. There is one mention of reversal. It requires the host to stand before the engine during coronation and reject the imposed order by blood and name. Dangerous, possibly fatal, and that assumes she gets close. I can get her close. Sorel studied me. Can you get her to trust you enough to come? I thought of Apolline on the pyre, smoke in her hair and hatred in her eyes, and the answer lodged like glass in my throat. No. Sorelli nodded once, because lies would waste time we no longer had. Then you'll need another route. She rested her hand on the ledger. I'll leak copies of the pairing records into the lower city. If the sect has her, they'll move toward the coronation on their own. It was a brutal plan. It used her anger as leverage. I hated it because it would work. Do it, I said, and place my guard units at the outer aisles, not the throne steps. If fighting starts, I need the center of the hall open. Open for her? Open for the truth, I said, though the truth had become indistinguishable from her face in my mind. Chapter 5.
The oath blinded did not lock me in a cell. That would have been easier to resent. Instead, they gave me a narrow chamber with clean blankets, sent a healer to check the mark twice a day, and let me move through most of the lower sanctuary as long as an escort walked with me. I learned quickly why the escort was needed. The blind fought in corridors with hanging chimes and uneven floors, reading space through sound and memory, and I was a clumsy-sighted thing among them. More than once I nearly walked into a training blade. The sanctuary was not a nest of mystics, it was a machine of survival. Children sorted dried herbs. Old women copied stolen documents. Young omegas with scarred wrists practiced disarming larger opponents in total dark. Every wall I passed carried proof that people the Crown called weak had been building resistance under its feet for years. One afternoon, a girl no older than 16 guided me to the cistern chamber where fresh water pooled under a broken dome. Her name was Eudoxie, and the white film over her eyes made her seem gentle until she smiled. Then I saw all her missing fear. You still smell like him, she said matter-of-factly while she filled 2 pitchers. Less than the first day. Enough to make half the hall hiss when you pass. I almost dropped my cup. That is a vile thing to say to someone you've just met. Eudoxie shrugged. Truth usually is. She tilted her head as if listening to my pulse. Does it hurt?
What?
Wanting the one who hurt you. She lifted one shoulder. Most of us came here because somebody taught our bodies to betray our sense. It helps to say it plainly. The water in my mouth turned bitter. I thought of Leontes' hand on mine in the archive, huge and careful, as if I were made of rare glass instead of ordinary hunger and stubbornness. I thought of his voice turning to iron in the square. Yes, I said. It hurts. Eudoxie handed me the second picture. Good. Then you're not numb enough to be useful yet. She grinned at my glare. Mother Nereza says broken hearts either become chains or knives. We're all waiting to see which yours prefers. That night they showed me more records. Not just the crown's tables, but testimonies smuggled from noble estates. Omegas induced into pairing trances during festivals. Alphas promised heavenly sanction if they accepted assigned mates, couples whose so-called destiny disintegrated the moment they crossed the border into regions where the engine's rights did not reach. I read until the letters swam. Every page flayed something raw inside me. I had built my private grief on the idea that Leontes and I had been chosen and then broken. Now even the choosing had become suspect. Yet some testimonies made the opposite wound worse. There were pairs who had begun under crown manipulation and still ended up loving each other fiercely, choosing each other long after the engineered first spark should have faded. Human feeling had rooted through poison and called itself a garden anyway. I hated that possibility most of all. It left no clean villainy. It meant the heart could be fooled and still be real. On the second night underground, Mother Nereza sent for me after the bells for rest. I found her alone in the map chamber, standing over a table where the palace was drawn in charcoal lines and red pins. She did not turn when I entered. A leak reached us, she said, from inside the palace. She tapped a stack of fresh copies, coronation records, guard rotations, a diagram of the throne hall aisles. From Leontes? The question escaped before I could stop it. My shame followed one beat later, hot and immediate. Nereza heard both. Possibly, she said. Possibly from someone who wants us to think so. Her fingers rested over the charcoal throne. Either way, the root is real. She handed me one of the copied pages. I saw the high priest's seal, the note on resonance anomalies, and beneath that a half-burned annotation in another hand. If the marked bearer reaches the conduit willingly, imposed bonds may rupture. Willingly? The word crawled under my skin. So that is it, I said. You need my consent as much as my blood. Sacred systems always pretend consent after the fact, Nereza replied. This one, annoyingly, seems to need the genuine article at the final threshold. She faced me then, the lacquer over her blind eyes gleaming faintly. I will not lie. We need you, but if you choose not to go, we will keep hiding you. Until the crown finds me? Until the city burns. Her voice remained level. That is also possible. I looked down at the map. A line of red thread marked a path from service tunnels into the coronation hall. Another pin marked the place where I had nearly burned to death that morning. Above both, in my mind floated Leontes' face as he said, "Fate is not always mercy." If I go, I said slowly, I'm not going for your cause first. The admission came out colder than my pulse felt. I'm going because I want the truth from his mouth in front of everyone he rules. Nereza bowed her head a fraction. Revenge is often the first honest road to revelation. When I returned to my chamber, I could not sleep. The mark under my ribs burned as if some invisible hand had pressed a hot coin there. I pulled up my shirt and stared at the fractured crescent in the candlelight until the edges seemed to shift. For one impossible instant, another shape shone beneath it, thin and silver as frost on glass. A line, a thread, the ghost of a bond answering from far away. I closed my hand over the mark until my nails dug in. If you are playing me still, I whispered into the empty room, I will be the ruin of you.
Chapter 6. By the third morning, the palace smelled like polished stone, incense, and impending treachery. Tailors ran in corridors with ceremonial black. Priests sanctified the throne hall with bowls of lunar oil. Nobles arrived from outer packs wearing their ambition like perfume. I spent the day signing orders I intended to break. Arrest warrants for sect sympathizers, transit restrictions on lower city districts, a decree reaffirming the sanctity of the concordance right. Each document felt like another layer of filth on my hands. Morkant brought in 3 captured smugglers before noon. None belonged to the oath blinded. All were guilty of being poor and unlucky. He wanted public floggings to encourage cooperation. I gave him prison terms instead and watched suspicion sharpen in his eyes. "You grow merciful," he said when the room cleared. No, I answered. I grow efficient. Fear scatters rats. Pain teaches them where the grain is. I let silence stretch. If you disappoint me again, Captain, I'll demonstrate the distinction on you. He bowed. He also hated me a little more. Good. A man nursing resentment showed his throat sooner. After he left, Sorel entered by the hidden panel behind the map wall. The sect took the bait, she said. Movement in the shrine tunnels. They're coming tomorrow night. Relief hit first. Terror followed immediately behind it. Is she with them? Yes. I gripped the edge of the table until the carved wood creaked tomorrow night. One more day of distance, one more day for the hollow fragment to deepen in her, one more day for me to keep breathing while everything in me demanded I go underground, seize her by the face, and beg forgiveness I had no right to ask. Then we proceed, I said. Sorelli did not leave. There's a complication. I laughed without humor. Only one? Morkant has been meeting privately with the high priest. If they suspect you plan to interfere with the engine, they may force the coronation sequence early, before the assembly fully gathers. Her mouth flattened. And if the sect enters amid that, the hall becomes a killing floor. I shut my eyes for one breath. When I opened them, the room felt sharper, every angle a weapon. Then I need Morkant contained before dusk tomorrow. Alive? If convenient. Sorel's nod was almost approving. She vanished back through the panel. I stood alone among maps and decrees, and the bond thread beneath my sternum suddenly flared so hard I staggered. Not pain. Her. A rush of emotion crossing the hidden line, too strong to ignore. Rage, grief, resolve. Hers, unmistakably hers, followed by words I did not hear so much as feel. If you are playing me still, I will be the ruin of you. I stared at the wall as if it might dissolve and show me her face. Then, despite every sane instinct, I smiled once. Small, helpless, proud. Good, I said to the empty chamber. Come ruin me in person. My throat tightened on the next words. Just live long enough to do it. At twilight, I went alone to the upper shrine balcony overlooking the city. Fires glimmered along the streets. Bells tolled from the market quarter where they had tried to burn her. From here, the square looked clean, almost innocent. I remembered her tied to the post, smoke in her hair, defiance bright enough to shame every coward around us. I remembered the archive, the first instant our scents met, how my entire body had answered before my mind formed language. No engine had taught me the violence of that certainty. No priest had installed the need that now lived in my ribs like another heart. Perhaps the bond had been manipulated. Perhaps the gods themselves had become just another machine men learned to counterfeit. It no longer mattered in the way it once might have. What mattered was the choice that came after the spark. I had chosen her in the archive. I had chosen her again on the dais by making her hate me, instead of letting the dead moon find her through open devotion. Tomorrow, if the hall flooded with blood and holy lies, I would choose her a third time in front of the realm. Behind me, the chapel door creaked. I turned with my hand on my knife, but it was only a novice leaving fresh candles. She bowed too fast and nearly dropped the tray when she caught my expression. Forgive me, Your Highness. I made myself loosen, though fury still hummed under my skin. Go. She fled. I looked back over the city and saw storm clouds gathering over the western walls, low and bruised and silver-veined. The kind of weather that made old people mutter about omens and unfinished gods. Tomorrow, I said to the dark below. Come to me angry, Apolline. I know how to survive your anger. I touched the hidden line on my chest through cloth. It's your silence that would kill me. Chapter 7.
The night before the coronation, the sanctuary did not sleep. Blades were wrapped in cloth. Routes were whispered and re-whispered until even I could trace them in the dark. In the central hall, the youngest children were sent deeper underground with the oldest healers, because everyone expected blood above. I sat at a stone table while Eudoxie braided my hair tightly away from my face. She worked fast, tugging harder than necessary whenever my hands shook. Stop thinking like prey, she muttered. You're not walking enchained? No, I said. Only into the center of the kingdom that wants me dead. Much better. She tied off the braid. There's the tone. Mother Nereza arrived carrying one final bundle of papers wrapped in oilskin. For your eyes alone before we leave, she said. Her attendants withdrew at once. Even Eudoxie hesitated only a second before stepping back into the corridor. I took the bundle with suddenly numb fingers. If this is another lesson in how thoroughly the crown lies, save your breath. I'm already convinced. This may unconvince you. Nereza tilted her head toward the pages. Read. Inside lay a narrow ledger leaf torn from a larger book. The ink had bled at the edges from damp, but the writing remained legible. At the top was Leontes' name. Beneath it, the long list of failed approved pairings I had already seen in copied form. Then, lower down, a separate notation in a different hand. Unregistered contact event in lower archive. Subject Apolline Verenne. Resonance immediate, total, and unscripted. Engine non-responsive. Diadem channels inactive. Classification impossible. I read the line again and again. Impossible, I said. But this time the word came out as a prayer instead of a denial. Nereza's blind face gave nothing away. We stole that page from the crypt this evening. It was hidden behind the official record. If genuine, your recognition with him was not crown-fashioned. My heartbeat turned violent. The room seemed to tilt. The stone table, suddenly the only solid thing in the world. Then why condemn me? Because he is a coward, Nereza said. Then, after a beat, or because he feared something worse than your hatred. Her mouth tightened. Both can be true. I looked down at the page until the letters blurred. The first night in the archive rose in me with unbearable force. His stunned laughter, his hands trembling, the tenderness so raw it had made me trust him before I knew his favorite color or the shape of his temper. If that had been real, then the wound of the pyre cut even deeper than I had allowed myself to feel. Real or not, he had still left me to fire. Real or not, I still wanted answers enough to bleed for them. Nereza rested her palm lightly on the table between us. Listen carefully. When we enter the hall, your first instinct will be to look for him. Fight it. Look for the engine beneath the throne platform. The mark will feel it. And if he tries to stop me, then decide whether you believe his body or his crown. For the first time since I met her, something like pity softened her voice. Child, sometimes love is the finest disguise power ever wears. Sometimes it is the only thing that tears power down. Tomorrow you learn which one yours is. She left me with the stolen page. I folded it once and slid it inside the binding at my wrist, beneath the strip of leather holding my hidden knife. Then I stood, because if I stayed seated I might collapse into the kind of grief that never gets up again. In the corridor, the oath-blinded were already forming ranks by touch and breath. Veils, blades, ash. Eudoxie pressed a dark cloak into my hands and smiled with all her missing fear. Ready? No, I thought. Furious, heartsick, hopeful in the worst possible way but not ready. Yes, I said. We climbed toward the city through tunnels wet with ancient salt, and with every step the hidden bond thread in my chest burned brighter, as if somewhere above, in all that cold stone and ceremony, Leontes had turned toward the same storm. I hated him. I wanted him. I wanted the truth more than both. By the time we reached the final gate beneath the palace, dawn's first bells had begun to ring. The coronation day had arrived, and in the dark just before the door opened, I touched the stolen page at my wrist and made myself one vow. If he had lied, I would destroy him before his kingdom. If he had loved me, I would make him prove it with the crown watching.
Chapter 8. Dawn came armored in silver rain, and the palace woke snarling. Servants ran under vaulted ceilings with armfuls of black silk and polished iron. Priests scattered lunar salt across the throne hall floor, and every corridor carried the same metallic scent of fear disguised as ceremony. By the time the first bells rang, I had already broken one goblet, signed 6 decrees I meant to nullify by nightfall, and decided exactly which men I would kill if Apolline bled on that floor. Sorelli found me in the antechamber behind the throne hall, fastening the ceremonial cloak over a heart that felt too violent for pageantry. She did not bow. She never bowed when the matter was grave enough to strip titles down to bone. Morkant moved early, she said. He doubled the inner guard without your order and stationed archers above the south gallery. Her mouth flattened. He expects an intrusion. He also expects to survive it. Then he has misjudged the morning. I took my sword from the stand and tested its weight. Where is he? At the lower armory, pretending he was called there. She handed me a folded scrap of parchment, and I found this in the sealed priestly archive. I opened it and felt the world narrow. Not because of the script, I already knew the hand, because of the name at the bottom. Nereza Vaudrien, Royal Astromancer of the Concordance Project. My gaze snapped up. Nereza, once Sorel said, before she burned her own sight and vanished into the lower city. Her cane clicked once on the stone. Your sect saint was one of the minds that built the crown's pairing system. Something ugly and cold settled into place inside me. Apolline, underground with the oath blinded. Nerissa feeding her documents, truths salted with lies, guiding her toward the coronation under the banner of liberation. The shape of the trap became suddenly hideously elegant. What did she want before she disappeared, I asked. Sorel's good eye held mine. Not reform, rupture. The project was meant to stabilize the realm by manufacturing limited compatibility events around the throne. She argued that if desire could be governed, power could be redistributed. A bitter pause cut across her mouth. Then the old texts about the hollow fragment were unearthed, and she changed. She began speaking of an ending pure enough to erase the entire hierarchy at once. I saw it then. Not the details, not yet, but the hunger beneath her movement. She had not saved Apolline from the pyre because she pitied her. She had needed her alive, frightened, angry, and willing to step into the heart of the machine. A marked host, a real resonance, a coronation conduit, I said. She means to crack the whole system open. And if the fragment comes through fully, Sorella said, it will not stop with the system. My hand tightened around the parchment until the fibers creased. For 3 days I had been splitting my fury between palace priests and my own guilt. Now it found a third target, older and calmer, and far more patient than either. I almost admired the cruelty of it. Nerissa had not needed Apolline to trust me. She had needed her not to. Morkant first, I said. We found him in the lower armory exactly where Sorella said he would be, helmet off, speaking too softly to 2 men whose loyalty I had already bought away from him. When he saw me in the doorway, his hand dropped to his sword with the quick reflex of a man who knows he has been measured and found wanting. Your Highness, he said. I was just seeing to the... I crossed the room and drove him into the weapons rack before he finished. Steel clattered around us. He was big, strong, seasoned, but rage gives clarity to the body, and I had been walking inside a furnace since the square. The archers in the south gallery, I said, forearm crushing his throat. The private meetings with the high priest, the sealed orders you signed in my name. I leaned closer until he could smell exactly how little mercy remained in me. Tell me which part you thought I would forgive. His face purpled. I was protecting the right. From whom? His eyes flickered. Not to the priests, not to the sect. Upward just once, with the instinctive fear men show when they think of something larger than their own schemes. From what comes through the girl? I loosened just enough for breath, not enough for comfort. And when did the high priest explain that to you? Not him, Morkant rasped, the blind woman. She said if the host reached the engine willingly, the realm would be remade. She said you were too compromised to do what must be done. He swallowed hard against my arm. She said the girl would destroy you. A short, savage laugh left me before I could stop it. That part may yet be true. I released him only to slam the pommel of my sword into his temple. He collapsed bonelessly across the stone. My guards stepped forward at once. Bind him, I said. Gag him. Put him in the chapel crypt where the bells will hurt his skull every hour. I looked down at him as blood crept from his hairline. If he escapes, start running before I hear it. When we were alone again, Sorelle exhaled through her nose. You're taking this remarkably well. No, I said, I'm simply out of room for new forms of betrayal. She almost smiled. Then one last complication. The priests moved the sequence forward. The diadem will be brought out before full assembly. They fear delay. Good, let them fear. I turned toward the stair that led to the antechamber. Rain struck the narrow windows like handfuls of thrown beads. Open the west servant passage on my mark. If Apolline enters from below, I want one route in that does not look like a trap. She may think every route you offer is a trap. The truth of that cut cleanly. Then I'll give her the choice in public, I said. No lies, no masks. If she condemns me before the court, she will at least do it with all the knives on the table. Sorelle studied me for a long beat. You love her. The words should have made me defensive. Instead, they landed with the strange stillness of something that had already decided itself. Yes. Even if the bond was tampered with. Yes. Even if she walks into that hall and chooses to ruin you? I thought of Apolline on the pyre, spitting betrayal through smoke, and the answer came easy as blood. Especially then. By the time I stepped into the robing chamber, the coronation garments waited on their stand like an execution laid out in silk. Black coat, silver clasps. The collar worked with moon thread. The gloves I did not put on, because if I touched her today, I meant to do it with bare hands. Through the walls, I could already hear the hall filling. Nobles, priests, pack heads, the high murmur of a kingdom gathering to witness sanctified control. Somewhere beneath all of it, so faint most men would have missed it, the bond thread in my chest gave one bright pull. She was here. Every instinct in me went feral at once, not from fear, from proximity. From the unbearable knowledge that after days of ash and separation, the air inside the same palace now touched us both. I closed my eyes for 1 second and pictured her face not as it had been on the pyre but in the archive, candlelight catching in her lashes, disbelief melting into wonder as recognition struck us both open. That was the memory I carried into the hall. Not because it hurt less, because it was the truth no ritual had given me. "Bring out the diadem," I said. Chapter 9.
The servant corridor into the palace was too narrow for breath and too damp for fire, but my skin still remembered the heat of the square. I moved with the oath blinded in a line of silent bodies, dark cloaks brushing stone, each step measured against the tolling bells above. Under my sleeve, the stolen ledger page pressed against my wrist like a second pulse. We emerged behind a screen of carved lattice in the western service gallery. Through its pattern I saw the throne hall unfold in silver, black, and human hunger. Noble houses crowded the tiers in jeweled rank. Priests in white lunar robes ringed the central dais. Above them hung banners stitched with the old lie, "Harmony through fate." Then I saw him. Leontes stood at the head of the aisle in coronation, black silver fastenings crossing his chest like restrained lightning. He wore no crown yet, but the room bent around him as if one already existed in the air over his head. A prince built for command, a man I had once believed would touch me gently forever. My body recognized him before my mind could weaponize itself again. Warmth hit first, hot and humiliating, then grief so violent it almost dropped me to my knees. I hated that love and fury could live in the same ribcage without killing each other. Eudoxie's fingers closed hard around my forearm. "Breathe," she whispered. "Don't let your face answer him before your mouth does." On my other side, Mother Nereza stood very still, blind eyes tipped toward the center of the hall. "The engine is awake," she said softly. "Can you feel it?" I could. The mark under my ribs had begun to burn the moment we crossed into Palace Stone, but here the sensation sharpened into something almost directional, not pain alone. Attraction, a pull from beneath the throne platform, deep and wrong and intimate, as if the mechanism below knew my name in a language older than speech. "When the high priest calls the oath," Nereza murmured, "step into the center. Show them the records. Make him answer before the realm. When the path opens, cut your palm and speak your rejection." I nodded because motion was easier than thought, yet the closer the rite came, the less certain I felt of the shape beneath her instructions. Not because the goal had changed, because the mark in my flesh reacted to her voice with a thin, ugly thrill that made my stomach tighten. Priests moved forward carrying the diadem on a black velvet cushion. It was smaller than I imagined, a circle of dark metal set with milk-white stones, beautiful in the way poison things often are. When the hall lights struck it, silver channels flickered within the band like veins. The high priest lifted his hands. "Before moon and realm, we bind order to blood." No, the word came from me before I chose volume. It cut through the hall anyway. Heads turned, the chant faltered. Every sound seemed to peel backward from the center as I stepped out from the service gallery and into full sight of the court that had condemned me. Gasps rippled up the tiers. Someone shouted "witch." Someone else dropped a goblet. On the dais, Leontes did not move, but every line in his body sharpened with such force that I felt it across the hall. "You want an oath?" I said, walking forward on legs that no longer felt like mine. "Then let this court hear one before it crowns a liar." My voice shook on the first sentence and steadied on the second. Anger was useful like that. 3 mornings ago, this prince called me his fate by night and sentenced me to fire by dawn. The court erupted at once, but I did not stop. I tore the folded page from my wrist and held it aloft. "And here is the record your priests hid, the one that calls our recognition impossible because the crown did not script it. So tell them, Leontes Dacien." I raised my eyes to his. "Did you lie in the archive or on the pyre?" Silence struck the hall like a blade. It spread outward from us in rings, forcing every whisper flat. He looked at me from the dais, and for one suspended instant the whole kingdom vanished. There was only the space between my demand and his answer. "On the pyre," he said. The hall inhaled. He descended 1 step from the dais, then another, not taking his eyes off me. "I lied on the pyre," he said again, louder now, each word carrying to the farthest tier. "Because when the mark rose on your skin, the priests of this court would have torn open our bond to track you and offered your body to the throne mechanism as holy necessity. I chose to make you hate me before I let them use you." My chest seized so hard I thought the mark had burst. I had prepared for denial, for political theater, for a smoother cruelty than the square. I had not prepared for the rawness in his voice when he named my hatred as the price he chose. The high priest recovered first. "Seize her," he snapped. "The marked girl defiles the rite." Guards moved. So did Leontes. He drew his sword in one fluid sweep and placed himself on the lower step between me and the nearest men. "Anyone who touches her dies." Chaos cracked wide. Nobles surged to their feet. Priests shouted blasphemy. Above, on the galleries, I saw ash-veiled shapes of the oath-blinded rise from among the servants and guests like shadows deciding to become knives. Eudoxie was suddenly beside a column with 2 blades in her hands. Nereza stepped into the aisle, slow and terrible and calm. "At last," she said, and though her voice was not loud, it reached me through the uproar with sickening clarity. "Truth from both mouths. Good. Now the door will open." The mark beneath my ribs flared so hot I cried out. Beneath the throne platform something answered with a mechanical groan, a deep metal shudder that seemed to come from under the whole hall. Stone seams lit silver. The floor itself began to glow in old lunar lines. I turned toward Nereza, horror rising too fast for language. "What did you do?" Her ruined face lifted toward me, and for the first time I understood that blindness had never made her harmless. "What your prince's father was too cowardly to finish," she said. "What this kingdom deserves."
Chapter 10. The first man to reach for Apolline lost his hand at the wrist. My sword cut through him, then through the shaft of the second guard's spear, and the hall dissolved into exactly the blood-soaked nightmare I had been trying to postpone since the square. Shields around the center. The high priest screamed, "Contain the host." Host. He said it now in public, because the machine had already awakened and masks become unnecessary when panic does the work for you. Priests rushed the deisect. Fighters dropped from the side aisles. Nobles scrambled over benches in jeweled terror, clutching their silks up from the spreading blood, as if fabric mattered. Apolline stood in the middle of it with one hand over her ribs, eyes wide not with weakness but comprehension. She had just realized what I had realized that morning. The palace had wanted to use her, and so had the people who saved her. "Apolline!" I cut down another guard and drove toward her. "Do not let her near you." Nereza laughed softly, almost fondly. The sound raised the hair on my neck more than any shout in the room. "Too late for warnings, Your Highness. The willingness was never for the machine." She spread her hands as silver lines flared brighter beneath the floor. "It was for the breach." Sorelli had been right only in part. Nereza had not merely wanted to destroy false bonds, she wanted to invert the entire crown system at the moment of maximum ceremonial focus, using Apolline's mark and our unscripted resonance as leverage enough to split the conduit wide. Not reform, not liberation, catastrophe dressed in the language of justice. "You built this," I said, backing toward Apolline as Morcant's replacement guards closed from the side. "You built the engine and then built a cult around being its victim." "Yes," Nereza said, "because men like your father would only understand the cost of sacred hierarchy when it devoured their heirs." Her head tilted toward Apolline. "And because no false pair would ever open the deep chamber. I needed a real one. Rare things are useful." The words struck Apolline visibly. I saw the wound of them on her face, even through the rising light. Real one, in a sane world that truth would have been a gift. Here it landed amid treachery like a jewel dropped in fire. The high priest gathered his robes and pointed at Nereza with a hand that trembled more from outrage than fear. "You swore obedience to the concordance." "I swore to end the wars you bred." Her smile sharpened. "You mistook method for devotion." So that was the final shape of it. My father had used Nereza's brilliance to counterfeit fate and leash the Pax. The priests had sanctified it. Nereza had waited, blind and patient, for a true bond powerful enough to crack her own creation. Apolline and I had not been the authors of this disaster. We had been the missing components. Pawns, both of us moved by enemies who thought pain made people predictable. They were wrong. The floor split with a shriek of metal. Below the throne dais, black mechanisms turned into view, rings within rings, silver channels flooding with light, crystal reservoirs trembling in their mounts. The engine had risen. At its center, a narrow aperture opened like an eye. Apolline gasped. Her knees buckled once. I reached her just as Nereza's nearest followers lunged, and from then on the world became impact and instinct. I dragged Apolline behind me, parried a sect blade, drove my elbow into a priest's throat, and heard Eudoxie somewhere to our left cursing like a delighted demon. "You should have told me," Apolline said, breathless with fury and pain. "I know. I would have hated you less if you'd trusted me. I killed the man charging her flank before I answered. I know that too. The admission cost less than it should have. There was no room left in this hall for pride, only truth or death, and truth had already arrived. Nereza stepped closer to the open engine, silver light painting the black lacquer of her blind eyes. Bring her to the center, she told her followers. The first chosen word must come from the host. Chosen, Apolline snapped, voice ringing suddenly clear. You fed me just enough truth to make me useful and call it choice. Nereza's expression did not change. That is how every power structure works, child. Mine will simply be shorter-lived. Apolline went still in a way I had learned to fear, because it meant her terror had found shape. She looked at Nereza, then at the high priest, then at the mechanism beneath the throne where false destiny and dead divinity had been sharing a spine all along. When her gaze returned to me, what I saw there was not helplessness. It was decision. What happens if I refuse both of you? She asked. The hall seemed to pause around the question. Even the high priest hesitated, because refusal had no place in the script from either side. Sorelli's voice cut from the west aisle where she had just appeared with 3 of my loyal guards, and a crossbow leveled at a priest's heart. If the marked host rejects the conduit by blood and true name, the engine destabilizes. It may collapse the imposed pairings entirely. May, Apolline said. There was only one record, Sorel answered. The witness died. Inconvenient, Nereza murmured. She moved then, faster than an old woman had any right to move, a hidden blade flashing from her sleeve. I saw the angle too late. The knife was not aimed at Apolline's throat. It was aimed lower toward the mark, toward blood enough to feed the opening. I shoved Apolline sideways and took the cut across my ribs. Heat tore through me. Nereza's blade skidded bone instead of finding her. I answered with my own sword, but one of her followers crashed into my arm and turned a killing stroke into a glancing slash across her shoulder. She hissed, retreated, and the silver light beneath the floor leapt higher as my blood struck the glowing seam. The engine roared, not mechanically, hungry. The sound that rose from the aperture was like breath pulled through a grave. Half the hall screamed at once. Lights shattered overhead, the smell changed ozone, old dust, and something emptier than rot. Apolline clutched my arm as darkness licked silver around the edges of her mark. Leontes? I turned to her and put my bloody hand against her cheek. Listen to me. Around us men were still fighting, but their shapes had gone strangely distant, as if the opening at the engine's core was drinking acoustics with light. Nothing that uses you owns you. Not the crown. Not her. Not this thing. Her eyes shone with terror and stubbornness. And what about you? The answer was the easiest truth I had spoken all day. I do not own you either. Something broke across her face then, not into weakness but into faith heard enough to matter. She nodded once, small, absolute. Then stand with me, I said. Chapter 11.
The hall had become a wound of light and shouting bodies, but his hand on my face made one impossible pocket of stillness inside it. Blood ran warm over his side where Nereza's blade had cut him. Priests were dying. Sect fighters were dying. Above us, stained glass moons rattled in their frames as if the palace itself wanted to come apart. And still, beneath all of it, the clearest thing in the world was the look in Leontes' eyes when he said he did not own me. No alpha in my life had ever spoken that sentence to me. Not the nobles who treated omegas as contracts waiting to happen, not the palace officials who filed our bodies into ledgers, not the holy machinery under the throne. In one breath, with a kingdom watching, he had given up the oldest weapon power has, something in me that had been clenched since the pyre unlocked hard enough to hurt. Not because everything was forgiven, it was not. Because for the first time since this began, I could choose from clear ground. Nereza gathered herself near the engine, one hand pressed to her bleeding shoulder, silver light making a saint's ruin of her. Do not romanticize him, child, she called. He would still be wearing the diadem if you had not walked in. Yes, I said, turning toward her. And you would still be calling yourself our salvation if I had not. Her mouth tightened. Good. I wanted the mask to slip. I wanted every person in that hall to see that tyranny did not become mercy just because it spoke in a woman's voice. The mark under my ribs burned so fiercely I could barely stay upright, yet now the pain carried pattern. Pull from the engine, pull from Leontes, 2 claims, 2 directions, one cold and devouring, the other wounded and human and waiting for my answer instead of stealing it. I stepped toward the open conduit. Apolline, Leontes said behind me, fear stripping his voice down to something rawer than command. He would have followed if I asked. He would have dragged me back if I let him. Instead, he stopped, because choice meant he had to. I looked over my shoulder at him. Rain light from the high windows silvered the blood on his mouth, the black of his coat, the line of his chest where I now knew another hidden wound had been burning in answer to mine. If I die, I said, you do not get to make a martyr out of me. Even then, with ruin opening at our feet. His expression changed with something like offended devotion. If you die, he said, I will be far too busy following. My laugh came out half broken. It was enough. I reached the center seam of the floor and the world lurched. The engine recognized the mark at once. Silver light climbed my skin. The dark aperture widened and a whisper moved through it. Ancient and empty and hideously intimate. Mine. It breathed without sound. No, I whispered back. I drew the small knife from my wrist. My hand shook only once before it steadied. Around me, priests had gone quiet. Sect fighters had gone quiet. Every side understood instinctively that all their scripts now balanced on a girl who had been tied to a stake 3 days ago and survived long enough to become inconvenient to everyone. I cut my palm. Blood hit the lit seam and the engine convulsed with a sound like chains pulling through stone. The whisper in the aperture sharpened, furious now. The mark under my ribs answered with agony bright enough to white out the edges of the room. State the rejection, the high priest shouted, unable to stop himself from sounding hopeful that I would choose his wording. She knows no rejection but the one I taught her. Nereza said at the same moment. They had never heard themselves more clearly than they did then. 2 powers, same instinct. Tell the woman which words to use and call it destiny. I raised my bloody hand and spoke not to them, not first, but to the machine that had eaten generations of choice and called it harmony. I reject every bond forged without consent, I said, and my voice carried with shocking ease, silver light hurling it into every corner of the hall. I reject every crown that names ownership holy. I reject every god, dead or living, that enters through fear. The engine screamed. Cracks raced through the black metal rings above. Somewhere in the galleries, nobles cried out in confusion, then in something stranger. Relief. Shock. I felt it ripple through the room as scent signatures shifted wildly. Artificial ties snapping. Long-faked compatibilities collapsing into honest uncertainty. But the aperture did not close. The darkness at its center thickened instead, reaching toward my ribs with starving intent. Nereza's expression changed at last, not to triumph but alarm. The real bond, she breathed. It wants the real bond. Of course it did. The false structures were crumbling. The one thing left strong enough to bridge flesh and conduit was the thing no one had manufactured after all. Leontes, I said, and this time it was not accusation. He came to me at once. Hands grabbed for him from both sides. He tore free. A priest tried to block him and took Sorelli's bolt through the throat. Eudoxie slashed the hamstrings of a sect zealot who lunged for my back. Then Leontes was in front of me, breath harsh, face white under all that blood and fury. Tell me what you need. The question almost undid me. Not what he needed, not what the realm needed. Me. I put my bleeding palm against the hidden burn beneath his chest, where I had glimpsed the answering line in my candlelit room, and somehow known it was there. His whole body jerked under the touch. The bond rose between us with the violence of first recognition and the steadiness of something no machine could counterfeit twice. Not fate, I said, because I wanted the hall to hear, and because I needed the universe to hear even more. Not because a crown said so, not because pain drove us together. My voice shook, then sharpened like glass. I choose you, Leontes Dacien, freely. The darkness hit us. It poured up from the aperture in a column of cold absence, not a body but a hunger wearing the memory of one. For one hideous second, I felt it searching every fracture in me. The pyre, the betrayal, the loneliness of being unclaimed by any pack, the fury of wanting to belong nowhere that would cage me. Then it met the place where I had just chosen. It found no door there, only a wall made of will. Leontes' hand locked over mine against his chest. My turn, he said, voice rough and bright with pain. He looked straight into the dark as if it were merely another enemy bleeding in front of him. I choose you, Apolline Verenne, not as possession, not as proof, as my equal, if you will have me. Until death is tired of hearing me say it. The bond exploded, not outward in domination, outward in light. Warm silver, unlike the engine's cold channels, burst from where our hands met, ran through the seams of the floor, and then backfed into the mechanism beneath the throne. Every false line in the hall flashed once and shattered. The diadem on its velvet cushion split clean down the center. Neretza screamed. The high priest dropped to his knees. Around us the dark presence recoiled as if burned, dragged backward by the collapse of every stolen pathway it had been fed for generations. It reached once more for my mark. This time Leontes stepped in front of me and took the force of it with a sound I will hear in my bones for the rest of my life. No. I caught him as he staggered. The line under his sternum blazed through cloth, answering my crescent. The two wounds lit together, then folded inward, silver sealing black, thread-mending fracture. For one suspended, impossible heartbeat, I felt us both standing inside the same choice, holding the dark between us not because we were destined to, but because we had decided nothing else would have me. Then the engine broke. The central rings burst apart in a rain of black metal and white fire. Shockwave hit the hall. People screamed and fell. I went down with Leontes over me, his body curling around mine by reflex, even half-conscious, sheltering me from the splintering ruin. When the roaring stopped, rain was falling through the cracked dome. Priests lay scattered among broken stone. Nobles huddled in soaked silks, staring at one another with the dazed horror of people who had just felt their ordained lives become optional. Nereza knelt near the wreckage of the engine, blood and rain running together over her face.
She laughed once, weakly. At least it broke.
Yes, I said, gathering Leontes' head into my lap as he fought for breath. But not the way you wanted. Her blind eyes turned toward us. For the first time, there was no doctrine in her expression, only exhaustion ancient enough to be sad. Then do better with the remains, she whispered. She sagged sideways and did not move again. I looked down at Leontes. Blood soaked his side and mine. His lashes were wet with rain. His mouth parted on a painful breath as he stared up at me, disbelieving and alive. You chose me, he said, as if the fact was too large to fit in him. I touched his face with my uninjured hand. Don't make me repeat myself on a floor full of corpses. His laugh broke into a grimace. Cruel, you set a terrible example.
Chapter 12. I woke 3 days later in my own bed to the scent of cedar, linen, rain-washed stone, and Apolline asleep in the chair beside the window with a book fallen open on her lap. For one stunned second I thought I had died into some unforgivably gentle afterlife. Then pain tore across my ribs and reminded me that kingdoms rarely let you off so easily. Her head came up at the sound. Sleep left her face in an instant, replaced by alertness so fierce it nearly looked like anger. Good, anger meant life. Anger meant she had not forgiven enough to become unrecognizable. If you were going to die, she said, standing so fast the chair legs scraped, you could have done it before making me sit through 12 council arguments about succession. My throat was raw with disuse, but delight still found it. You stayed for the council? I stayed because every priest in the palace wanted me hidden. Every surviving noble wanted me blamed, and half the lower city wanted to set the banners on fire. She came to the bedside and put a hand flat against my chest as if checking I remained inconveniently solid. Also because you are impossible to threaten properly while unconscious? I covered her hand with mine. The bond between us no longer burned like a concealed wound. It moved quietly now, warm and clear. A living thing that did not push so much as answer. Real, chosen. Mine only in the sense that my heartbeat was mine. Present, necessary, impossible to own without also belonging to it. What happened after, I asked. The engine is destroyed. The diadem is useless. The pairing registries are being seized from every district archive. Her mouth curved, sharp and pleased. Dame Sorel has been terrifying the court into legislative reform. Eudoxy stole 6 ceremonial goblets and claims it is reparations. Reasonable. The high priest is in chains. Better. She watched me a long moment, all wit falling away by degrees, until only the bruised truth remained between us. And you, she said quietly, are king only if you still want to be. There it was, the choice after catastrophe. Not destiny, not inherited machinery, a man, a woman, a broken realm, and the question of what to do with survival. I want to keep them from rebuilding the old system, I said. I want to tear out every law that treats bond as ownership. My fingers tightened over hers, but I won't take the throne through the diadem, or through any right that denies what happened in that hall. Then how? By oath before the council and the city, limited term until a new charter is ratified, shared authority with pack and caste representation. I smiled faintly at the disbelief flickering through her. Yes, I listened when you argued with archivists in the lower stacks. You were terrifying then too. She exhaled something between laughter and grief. You nearly had me burned and still somehow remained insufferably attentive. I deserved that. I deserved worse. Apolline, I said, and the use of her name in that quiet room felt heavier than any title ever had. I'm sorry. Her face changed at once, not softened. She was not so simple, and I would not have loved her if she were, but opened enough for the words to enter. I am sorry I chose silence instead of trusting your strength, I said. I am sorry I made a spectacle of your fear to save your life. I would do anything to spare you the pyre again, including damn myself, but if I ever decide for you that way without your consent, you should leave me bleeding in a corridor. A slow heat moved through her gaze, dangerous and bright. That is not nearly enough punishment. No, but it is a beginning. She leaned down, bracing one hand on the mattress beside my shoulder. Close enough that the soft, impossible sweetness of her scent curled through my lungs and settled where pain had been. A beginning, she repeated. Then hear mine. I am still angry. Some days I may be angry in ways that make the weather look courteous. You do not get to call that disloyalty. Never? You do not get to use my love as a political symbol. Never. And if I choose to stay, it is not because fate mated us, the moon blessed us, or the court approves. Her eyes held mine with ruthless tenderness. It is because when everything sacred turned out to be a machine, you were the one thing that bled and still asked what I wanted. I think my heart stopped for a whole beat. Stay, I said, and there was no prince in the word, no king, no heir, just a man who had nearly lost the center of himself to fire and arrogance and politics, and did not intend to make the same mistake twice, not as subject, not as symbol. Stay because I will spend the rest of my life earning that choice. Her smile came slowly, like sunrise through storm damage. That, she said, is finally something worth saying yes to. When she kissed me, it was not the frantic collision of the archive or the desperate vow of the throne hall. It was steadier, wiser, warm with all the danger we had already seen and all the deliberate softness still possible after it. I kissed her back with careful greed, one hand cupping the back of her neck, and when she made that small sound against my mouth, the whole ruined kingdom outside the windows ceased to matter for one exquisite second. Months later, the city square where she had been condemned held no pyres at all. By decree and public spectacle both, we had the execution post dragged down, chopped into kindling, and used to heat the first winter kitchen built for lower city families under the new charter. The priests called it sacrilege, the people called it efficient, Eudoxy called it poetic. The council oath was taken without diadem, without scent rights, without any engine humming below the floor. Representatives of every district stood witness. Omegas signed the charter in their own names. Pact contracts became revocable. Bond declarations required mutual consent before law. The old noble houses smiled tightly and learned new vocabulary. Apolline refused 3 proposed titles before inventing one no court historian had ever recorded. Royal Archivist of Unfinished Truths. It was absurd. It was perfect. She spent her days stripping hidden records from sealed chambers, and her nights telling me exactly which ministers lied more gracefully than they believed. Sometimes in the dark, the memory of the pyre still came for her. I learned the signs, the stiffness in her breathing, the way her hand found the scar beneath her ribs. On those nights I held her if she wanted holding, gave her space if she wanted that instead, and thanked whatever remained of the moon that loving her had become an action rather than a doctrine. The mark on her skin did not vanish entirely, neither did the silver line across my sternum. They faded into pale scars that answered each other only when we chose closeness, never when anyone else demanded it. A reminder, perhaps, that destiny had tried to use us and failed. In spring, when the first clean wind came over the river, and the city stopped expecting collapse every time a bell rang, I took Apolline to the old archive where we first found each other. Dust still lived in the corners, candles still threw uneven gold against the shelves. History still smelled like paper and secrets. She stood in the exact spot where recognition had struck us and folded her arms. "If you kneel," she said, "I may throw a book at you." I wasn't planning to kneel. I stepped close enough that her pulse changed, close enough to feel mine answer. I was planning to ask something dangerous. Her mouth tilted. "That is your favorite kind." Yes, I took her hand. No ceremony, no court, no machine under stone, just skin, warmth, choice. Fate can go to hell. The moon can mind its own grave. Choose me again anyway. Her eyes brightened with that fierce, luminous humor that first ruined me. "You make a compelling legal argument I learned from an archivist." She rose onto her toes and pressed her forehead to mine, exactly as she had that first impossible night, only now there was no confusion in it, only recognition remade by will. "Then here is my official response," she whispered. "Yes." If you've listened all the way through, thank you so much. Please let us know what could be improved and what you think of the story.